Welcome to this Lead Different series where we're going to explore a couple of concepts, one from neuroscience and one from psychology, that are going to help us with our most challenging interactions. Now, these can span from raising and confronting our most brutal facts to engaging in vigorous debate and dialogue, or if we have difficult feedback to either give or receive. Now, the first concept we're going to look at comes from neuroscience, and it's called the amygdala hijack. And this deals with the way our primitive brain works, the way it was intended to work, and how it can interfere with us being effective in the business world. Now, to understand this, we need to learn a little bit about how our brains are structured. And first, the neocortex is the frontal lobe where we have rational thinking and judgment, logic takes place. So this is sort of the calm, rational part of our brain. And the amygdala, another important piece, more linked to our survival instincts, is right at the top of our spinal column. Now, how we're all hardwired, when we perceive a threat, the neocortex actually shuts down and the amygdala goes on high alert. Right? This is when fight or flight math starts to take over and our rational thinking, our capacity for rational thinking, is greatly diminished. Everything that we take in, all of our senses start to absorb what's happening around us through a filter of danger. Now, this is really intended to help us with pure survival instinct, right? If there's a tiger in the room, if we have to decide whether we're going to fight or flee, right? This is when the amygdala gets triggered. And if this happens in our personal lives, in our interactions, it can make us ineffective, as you can imagine. There are situations that we're going to talk about, and probably some that you'll recognize, that the amygdala could actually get triggered at a time when we actually need more of that rational thinking. So it's going to be really important for us to recognize when we or others have this happen to us and be able to manage that so that we can remain effective, especially in these really challenging interactions that we have. Have you ever felt like somebody put you on the spot, you got caught off guard with a tough question or some feedback that you weren't ready to hear or you didn't anticipate? Maybe you've been frustrated during a discussion, or maybe you put out an important message and had it been met with silence when you really need to have active discussion. Maybe you or the conversation itself triggered other people's amygdala. You might have seen that happen before. Or maybe you've seen a difficult conversation turn emotional or watched others get caught in a conflict loop. We're going to explore that here in a little bit. But where people are talking past one another, some of these situations where we get that sort of heightened emotion, the amygdala is, on fire, we can get a lot of energy out, but we really aren't effective in dealing with that interaction in a positive way. We don't get a positive outcome. So we have to learn how to recognize and respond differently. These are examples of how the amygdala hijack actually happens. And transactional analysis, this next puzzle piece that comes from psychology, is going to show us the mechanics of how our interactions can be diagrammed, and maybe where we can start to recognize how this amygdala hijack can happen and make us ineffective. If we recognize these situations and learn some simple techniques to how to restore that neocortex, to get back to sort of rational thought when we really need it, then we can be more effective. I often coach teams or leaders to actually look ahead for situations, anticipate situations where maybe they feel like there's a trigger there waiting for me. I might get in that situation where I get ineffective, and then game plan to do something different. So let's examine some tactics that can make us more effective in these situations. And the first is to recognize the hijack, and that's whether it's ourselves or the people that we're interacting with. You can't just keep going forward in an exchange where someone is doing fight or flight math if you're getting silence or violence, especially the silence part. We could tend to want to keep going, and they've checked out of the conversation. We're not going to be effective. You call a mental timeout. There's nothing wrong with a period of silence or to collect your thoughts. Sometimes it will seem like an eternity. Sometimes we're concerned about filling every moment. It's okay to pause. A lot of science around slowing your breathing down, slowing your discussion down and getting to a proper tone that can restore safety in a challenging conversation. We talk a lot in Lead Different about the use of questions, leading with questions that we borrow from Good to Great. This is a great situation where if you ask a question to try to get clarity on a point that they're making, so you really make sure you understand and state the other person's side. This shows active listening. Now, I've seen some recommendations lately online that says where you can interrupt the pattern by saying, "Hey, I hear you." Well, that just means you're trying to stop them from talking and you're ready to respond. What we're talking about here is actually restating their position and checking do I have this right? This is where you're coming from. Now we're getting to a point where we're being respectful in the conversation. Now we have a chance to get it back to being productive. And again, the key is we can't keep going forward unless we restore safety. This idea that you can keep moving forward when someone is in the wrong state of mind, it's something that we have to get used to. It takes practice to do this, but it's going to make you more effective, trust me. Now, to really put these practices into play, it's really helpful to be able to reflect on maybe a past episode. If you can think of something recent, an interaction that wasn't effective, where you felt like maybe either you or the other party had this amygdala hijack take place. Think about how you might do that differently. Now, I always encourage folks that if you were ineffective in an interaction, sometimes people just feel bad about that and move on. It's okay to ask for a mulligan. It's okay to circle back to someone and go, "Hey, I really want to revisit that conversation that we had about X, Y, or Z," and have a chance to regroup on that. You'll be amazed at how much trust you can build by doing that. And again, getting back to a place where you can restore some safety and have more productive interactions with that person or on that subject in the future. Always think it's great to look ahead. Like I say, if you plan out your next week or two, whatever time frame or horizon you look at, you probably know those interactions, whether it's a specific meeting or a topic, a hot button for you, a person. Think ahead and try to play out what your role is in the past failures to effectively interact. And then rehearse a little bit of what am I going to do different? How am I going to not get triggered or not trigger that other person, right? And journal these things. It's really amazing the power of being able to do this, put it down on paper, and do your own personal development. So applying these things is really, really important as you're learning them. Now, the next section that we're going to go into is from psychology, and it deals with ego states and how we can diagram using transactional analysis, how we can diagram these interactions and determine and maybe even see repetitive patterns where we've been ineffective. Now, transactional analysis developed by Eric Berne, again a psychologist, and he shares a model of ego states that everybody possesses. This is what I like about both the amygdala hijack and transactional analysis. These are both hardwiring that we have and from the neuroscience that all of us possess, and these ego states are something that we can all relate to, so it's pretty universal. Transactional analysis allows us to look at interactions, diagram them, and see how we can be more effective. And the ego states that he introduces, these are, when we talk about an ego state, we're talking about a system of feelings that in the behaviors that flow from those states that we get into. And first thing, we all have parents, and so the parent ego state is one that reflects a system of judgment in our parental figures. The adult ego state is one where we have and stay in an objective appraisal of reality. It's a thinking state. And then the child ego state is one that reflects the little boy or little girl. It's sort of our innocence or our feelings ego state. It's important to not confuse or bring other sorts of language like the child ego state would be childish or the parent would be mature. That analogy doesn't work here. That's not what we're talking about. Parent is judgment and child is more around feelings and innocence. So transactions are diagrammed by Byrne in a fashion where we talk about the agent, and you can see each of these circles represents the parent, adult, and child ego state, and then the respondent and their parent, adult, and child ego state, and allows us to show how the communication takes place across these two parties. Now, the ego states each have effective and ineffective versions, if you would. Now, blue, the color blue, is left for the states that are effective ego states, where we can have exchanges that are productive. And for the parental ego state, nurturing parent, which is where those judgments take place in the form of caring and there's a lot of empathy, the nurturing parent is a positive ego state. Adult is always a positive ego state because, again, it's very rational, it's objective, and it's an ego state that when we have these sort of challenging interactions, the more we can stay in it, the more we'll be very, very effective. Creativity is often associated when we can get into a free child state where we're open and honest, able to brainstorm, and innocence is at the forefront, and we don't feel guarded in our communication. So it can be a very, very effective ego state. Red ego states are the ineffective ones, and in the parent side of the ego state, it's the critical parent. You can imagine, right? This is a judgment that's based on being critical and controlling. And there's two ineffective ego states. Now think of fight or flight here, where we have the rebellious child, which is the fight ego state, and then the compliant child, which is silence. Now the challenge when we have crucial conversations. Now crucial conversations are when emotions run high, opinions vary, and the outcomes are uncertain, right? We're going to be challenged to stay in any of these blue ego states, if you would. Now, examples include being in a situation where you have to give corrective feedback, engaging in vigorous debate or dialogue, right? And we talked before about confronting brutal facts. Those are the kind of situations where we really need to be able to keep ourselves and others in effective ego states. If we find ourselves in these sort of interactions, often we're pretty nervous or can be nervous. If we ignore the other parties that are involved in the interaction and they go into a red state and we keep going, we really run the risk of being ineffective. We may get through an exchange, but the communication and the interaction is ineffective. So one of the diagrams that we're going to go into in this session is called the conflict loop. And this is you'll probably recognize where you've either been in one, you've fallen one, or you've seen other people get in it, right? When the agent transmits a message and it's in critical parent, right? It's in this sort of a judgment that's either critical or controlling. And then the respondent, right, goes into rebellious child, and a rebellious child will often flip up to critical parent and fire back. So they're going to return fire. And you can see how these red arrows crossing is what's called cross communication, right? So there's a lot of energy. There's communication taking place, but it is a cross. We're talking past one another. We're really not engaging in a way that's going to get to a positive outcome. And these things will continue on. You can see people go at these for a very long time until there's a winner or a loser, where, again, someone takes the position of critical parent and the other one takes compliance and they give up. Or if we're productive, someone reestablishes safety in a blue ego state, and we can get to the point where we get to an adult exchange and we can restore this particular discussion, break that conflict loop, and get it to an effective outcome. Now, interrupting the loop, very similar to what we were talking about before in terms of the tactics. First, you've got to recognize you're in it. And again, take a deep breath, see that you're in the middle of it, avoid reacting, and then correct your tone and your pace, going slower, taking a breath, getting the tone to be appropriate. And then again, the question. Asking a question is so powerful, but again, it has to be a legitimate question of, I really am seeking to understand your point of view. Restating their position, again, it can't just be, oh yeah, I hear you, now I want to talk. It's restating their position to go, so what I understand you're trying to communicate is blank, right? Acknowledge the conflict. It's okay to call a timeout and go, you know what, we're really kind of talking past each other. It's important for us to get to a place where we can kind of see both sides of this. In that mode, you can also establish, hey, let's talk about the things that we both have, in common. The common purpose that we have usually, even in these conflict loops, people can find that they have a common purpose. And if you have mutual respect, you can get back to safety, right? Finding a way in yourself to learn how to have these sort of exchanges and not debate to win, right? It's often, we often think that debating is about winning, that leading or we should engage in these things to have the outcome that we want. We want to win. It's, again, if we can't open our mind to other possibilities and try to find a way to bring other people along or find a middle ground, that's when we're going to be effective. So being predisposed is another really, really important thing that we can see from this model of ego states. In some cases, people can be predisposed to seeing a red state. It could be the history of the interaction with the people. It could be the way the person's delivered. It could be stresses that they're under. All right. This can happen with people who are miscast. The miscast, often have to operate with a lot of anxiety. So they have their amygdala flickering a lot of the time. So when someone delivers a message, we're talking about the agent now, could deliver a message perfectly in an adult state, the recipient can be looking for or hearing critical parent, and they can respond in a counterproductive way. It's really, really important for us to recognize when they're in fight mode, it's going to be pretty obvious, right? But when they go to silence, this is where, again, I've seen people just will continue to go through a discussion. If the other person is taking a compliant position, kind of malicious compliance, you can get through an exchange and have no outcome, right? Not the outcome, at least, that you want or need. So it's very, very important that we not only recognize ourselves in these things, but we recognize the cues in others and make sure that we're always keeping them in a blue state where we can be effective in these sort of challenging interactions. Corrective feedback is definitely one of these things where we're set up for ineffective communication and where the amygdala can fire, these ego states can get wrong. Can you imagine the person receiving the feedback, right? When you get negative feedback, by default, the way people often will deliver that feedback, it sets up the person to see this moment as a threat, right? The person delivering the feedback too, most of the time they're very nervous too, and so they've already come in with the adrenaline's going, they're breathing shallow. Some managers want to just kind of get this over with, so they're already kind of set up. Some have gotten to the point where they've told themselves a story, so they're coming into the room with critical parent already loaded. So this is why these are so difficult and why we have to do certain things to avoid this. One is to prepare and rehearse. Again, we often rehearse in a way where the person on the other side, the person that's acting like the recipient, kind of takes the worst case reaction and loses their mind, so that you have a real rep under your belt of learning, how do I establish safety? How do I not engage in this and make it a really, really negative interaction? Avoiding stories. There are stories that we can tell ourselves. I hear managers do this all the time, is that we'll not just look at the performance that we need to discuss with the individual or the behavior. We've somehow written some story that they don't care or they're negligent. We put some kind of negative spin on the why behind this without even talking to the person. We've already told that story, and so we can kind of come in poised to have an ineffective exchange, if you would. Delay, right? So now the delay frustration is when managers, are so reluctant to give feedback that they wait and wait and wait until they're too frustrated. Again, you're lit up. You got critical parent loaded for bear here. Maybe you've actually felt like you've had the conversation a number of times, and you really haven't been effective in these in giving the feedback. And so the final moment you deliver this feedback in a very negative way, or a critical parent way, and it just falls apart. You don't have a productive exchange there. So one of the techniques that we talk about is to actually, in feedback, is to lead with questions, right? Now this takes some rehearsing to do, to not have it be silly or trivial or trite, but there is a way to try to have a discussion with an employee, and through questions I want to understand, do they know where they're at? How do they feel about their performance? Right? If they feel bad about it already and they put it on the table, the whole dynamics of feedback change. If an employee puts a negative issue on the table versus me doing it, now it's me and that employee against that issue. We have a common enemy, or a common objective is to fix that. Versus when I slap it on the table, all of a sudden, even if the person feels really bad about their performance, their defenses are going to come up, right? We want to avoid that situation from happening. Not that you can do it 100%, but certainly this is one of the tactics. The more you do performance feedback, the more you have discussions, the more normal these situations will be. If you never have feedback, or if you do the annual thing, if all of a sudden now you want to have a talk with somebody, you want to meet them in the office, boy, their radar is going to be up, the amygdala is going to be set to fire, and again, you've set the table for a situation where you can't have the kind of feedback discussion that you need to. Now, the ultimate in performance management is to have people self-report, right? When we get to the point where somebody fits the job so well, they understand the outcomes, and they're reporting their status to us, the ability to ask a good question, a difficult question, and it becomes so much easier. This idea of being able to have a discussion about a performance issue becomes almost seamless. So this is sort of the evolution we want to get to, but recognize this is some of the science behind why we struggle with these sort of difficult interactions. Now, one of the leadership models that's really kind of old school, that's bad school, that we can actually diagram with transactional analysis is command and control. Now, command and control is when the leader's message is delivered or heard as critical parent, and that subordinate, the next level down, responds as compliant, right? That compliant subordinate now flips the critical parent and passes that message down in the same pattern, and it repeats. And the result is command and control, right? Again, most folks will think the military as being the gold standard for leadership, and command and control, right, is exactly what the military does. And they've actually broken that model quite a long time ago. They've gone to mission command, which is an evolution away from command and control, because command and control actually doesn't work very well, because it breeds an environment where silence is the norm, and down the food chain people actually will wait for direction, right? We're not empowering people through a leadership model of command and control, so it's long outlived its usefulness. But some people still view this as the way to actually lead an organization. And you can see how this pattern, through a series of these exchanges, actually flows downhill using critical parent and compliant child, and it just passes that message down the food chain. Now, there are drivers that lead to either using critical parent, or for us hearing critical parent to comply, and these can make us ineffective. These are drivers that people have. It sort of can be in your nature or the nurture, and they're kind of the echo of the critical parent inside of us, right? In some cases, they cause us to engage in ineffective behaviors versus being adult and being objective about situations. And you can imagine this, right? Some people have drives that are be perfect, right? They're perfectionist to the nth degree, or try hard. You got to give your full effort all the time, and hurry up, or be strong, or please others. These are drivers that can affect us or others, and they kind of create stories for us that can lead us to have some ineffective behaviors. And so the way we need to think about this, if a little bit of that perfectionist goes a long way, when it becomes harmful, we have to be able to diffuse that in ourselves and others and get it to be okay, right? To not be perfect, to be okay with something that's actually a suitable outcome. You're not, especially in leadership, you're never going to be perfect at leading, and you've got to get past that. You got to get to there. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's okay. It comes with the territory. That's true in a lot of roles, though. So we have to be able to fight this be perfect driver in ourselves and others at times. Try hard. It's okay to put a certain level of effort or your best effort in and not have to give it 1,000% every single time, right? There's times that you're just not going to be able to do that, and it's got to be okay. Hurry up. I love the old saying, be quick, don't hurry, right? Haste makes waste. There are times when you have to play that tape in your head to stop yourself from being ineffective. Being strong, people that stiff upper lip can cause us to withhold our feelings or bottle them in. Some of our hypos will use that be strong, and they will hide feelings that really need to be expressed or difficulties that they're having. This can lead to burnout. It can lead to some really serious issues. So we have to understand these things because they really apply to ourselves and others. And this is about leading. We're about trying to make ourselves and others more effective. And then the please others, people that all they can tolerate is making sure that there's harmony or they do everything for others. There are times in leaders you have to take care of yourself. Employees need to take care of themselves, or again, they can get themselves in harm's way. So these drivers are things that are kind of the echo of the critical parent, and sometimes how we will use critical parent on others. So we offer these up to, these are things that you can use to look at certain situations and try to come up with more effective behaviors. Again, effective ego states, if we can stay blue, this is one of the things that my teams in the past have talked about when we found ourselves in ineffective exchanges. If we use that term stay blue, right? It's a reminder for us that if we can use a parental, when it makes sense to be parental, in a nurturing form, we can unlock that free child in the people that we're interacting with, and vice versa. If we can use the adult ego state, right, it's really important. It allows us to be in these situations where it shows others that we respect them and their points of view, and they can also are free to state clearly what they think and feel, stay out of conflict loops, and one of the most important things is to keep candor up, keep the ability for people to feel like they can and should express themselves. So avoiding the silence that really can hamper most organizations from reaching their full potential. Certainly won't allow us to take this journey from good to great. All these things will circle back to the things we talk about in Lead Different, to that foundation of trust. You can imagine, right? The higher level of trust, the more we have the ability to have these exchanges. But again, some of these clues are the ways that we can affect how we interact with others that will actually build trust. So again, remember, this is a big full loop. And again, we know we want to have high levels of trust because it creates a faster speed of organization. It creates the opportunity to have organic engagement. Okay, as with any other tool or technique, I'm a big proponent of spaced repetition, practice, reflection. So just like we talked about before, take a moment and reflect. Think of where you might have had a conflict loop or had some of these drivers that were sort of behind an ineffective interaction that you've had, and see if you can go back and diagram them and understand what you might do different. Take advantage of that mulligan. Can you go revisit something where you were ineffective or somebody else was? Right? You can go back and say, hey, I don't feel like we left this very well, like you were still pretty upset. Right? Circle back. That's a really big piece of building trust and getting things back to where you want them to be. Again, looking ahead, using journaling and plan ahead to go, where do I see conflict loops, right? Some people may engage in these because they're almost like a ritual, right? Again, recognize that that's not an effective way for us to have vigorous debate and dialogue. Vigorous debate and dialogue is in search of the truth. It's not debating to win. So important distinction that we have to keep on the forefront. And I hope you're picking up some tactics and understanding to help you be more effective in getting there. Right? This is all comes back to our model, the flywheel. And there's examples of where we need to see this amygdala hijack and these ego states and level 5 leadership, right? Leading with questions and having humility. First two, again, feedback is fraught with these sorts of challenges and being able to understand people that are even high performers. When are they struggling, right? Again, the peer into that silence sometimes. It's not always that no news is good news, right? And these ego states can tell us that we need to dig a little deeper to understand folks. Obviously, brutal facts and debate and dialogue, these are areas where these principles come into play. So I add these to lead different so that they can help us all become more effective and try to touch that level 5 leadership model. I hope you got something out of these. Again, I encourage you to space repetition. Listen to this material over time, refresh this, and definitely use a journal, plan ahead, and look in the rearview mirror and try to wrestle with these principles to make yourself a more effective leader. It is time to lead different.